This week on Inside Olympia, they are two of Washington's longest-serving state senators, and they are both retiring at the end of this year. We sit down for exit interviews with Democrat Keiser and Republican Mike Padden. What are their proudest accomplishments, biggest frustrations, and most memorable moments? We'll ask them those questions and more.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Combined, they have served nearly 60 years in the state legislature. Now, two of Washington's longest-serving lawmakers are preparing to retire from public office. Why did they run in the first place? What were the high points and the low points of their decades of service? What advice do they have for their successors? We'll ask those questions and much more this hour when we sit down for exit interviews with Republican State Senator Mike Padden, who will join in our second half. But first, with Democratic State Senator and President Pro Tem Keiser, who joins me now. Good to see you.
Thank you, Austin.
The last time we spoke, we were talking about your book on the legislative process.
Right.
You gave lots of advice to newcomers, up-and-comers. But at that point, I don't know that we were contemplating your retirement. So why this decision? And I should note, it's midterm.
Correct. I did not have to run this year, but I did discover last year when I was doing the book stuff, and I realized that I had sort of passed on the torch, if you would, at least what I could do in terms of advice and observations and experiences. And so I thought, I was getting a little short-tempered, developing legislation for a 2024 session. I was getting cranky, and I wasn't having fun. I've always enjoyed the policy drafting, making of ideas that you do when you start with legislation in the beginning stages, and I just wasn't having that much fun. And I was short-tempered, just not with the game. So I thought I should think about that. I thought about it during session as I was having very long days with 8 a.m. hearings and Ways and Means going to 8 p.m. many times a week. And I was tired and, again, getting a little short-tempered about the whole thing. So I said, this is just not right. I have other things I can and should do, so let's pass the torch again and take a step back.
I suppose when you know, you know. It's time
That's
to go.
it.
So let's go back in time just to level set and to answer the question why you ran in the first place. You have a really interesting background. You were a television news reporter. You then went on to work for the Washington State Labor Council. I think that was the first context that I knew you in, and worked for the state's affiliated unions and were very much part of the labor movement, and then obviously have served in the legislature for I guess decades now. So what was it that led to the transition from journalism to communications work for a particular cause to serving in public office?
The first transition from journalism to being a communications director was family. I was adopting a new baby. I was trying to have my own children, and eventually did. But having a journalism job is unpredictable, and the state of our world's child care and support system for families back then was poor. Still is, by the way. And so I thought a communications job would be much more stable, was still a good job, and it was still in areas that I was interested in. But it was interesting because I was able to cover the legislature as a reporter. I was able to work in a kind of advocacy way as the communications director with the legislators. And then I became a legislator. And it's sort of an interesting journey to be able to see it from three different perspectives.
So what was it that first galvanized the move to run? Because deciding to run for public office is a big step.
Yes, and I don't think I knew what I was doing. I had the opportunity because one of our local legislators had run for statewide office and been defeated. And so there was an opening, and I saw it as an opportunity for something that I thought I could do pretty easily because after all, I'd covered it as a reporter. Yeah. I'd been an advocate, so why shouldn't I just be a legislator too? And I didn't know what I was doing. Obviously, I've learned a lot since then.
motivated you? You have worked and kind of earned your reputation working in labor-related issues, workforce issues, and also on healthcare. And that really doesn't, those are just two examples. But when you first ran, was there a particular motivating issue or topic?
Probably the hottest issue in my district at that time was the third runway for SeaTac Airport.
Because you live in your district is the Des Moines area.
That's right, Des Moines, Burien, Kent, SeaTac, and of course the airport, our big neighbor. And it was a very hostile relationship between our communities and the airport. This third runway we felt was being jammed down our throat. We resisted it in lots of ways. And it was really interesting because, of course, organized labor and the construction trades wanted to build, right? But I could not.
That is really interesting.
It was
Put
very
you in an
interesting
interesting
because
position.
I could not. I had to go door to door to talk to people in our communities about how the airport was overstepping its authority and how we had to contain it.
So it was a very backyard local issue
Yes.
that motivated you to run in the first
Correct.
place. When you got to the legislature, and remind us of the year this was?
1995.
95, okay. So
I was
30
appointed
coming up 30
because of
years
the
ago.
opening. I was appointed, and then I had to run in 96 for the 96 session.
What was the environment like? Now, this wasn't the 60s, it wasn't the 30s. I mean, we can go up on the fourth floor of the legislature and see the photos from the, previous classes. They're all men. They're all white men. I mean, the legislature did diversify, and especially more women started coming in. But by the 1990s, what was the environment you were walking into?
Well, I walked into a minority position because
interesting.
Democrats were in a minority then.
That was a kind of
And
rare
that was
moment in recent memory.
And that was a bit of culture shock for current legislators who'd been in the majority for a very long time, and they suddenly were in the minority after the 1994 elections. That was-
you came right in
That's
after
right.
the 94
So everybody
wave
was in a
election.
bit of state of shell shock, and the Republicans were.
It was a real drubbing for Democrats.
It was bad, and everybody was in shell shock. And I was able, in a way, because I was in the minority, to sit back and watch and learn, because we couldn't get anything done.
Right.
It was an opportunity in a lot of ways to get something understood, because you couldn't really do what you wanted to do.
And then as you were sort of taking in this new culture, having worked in newsrooms, having worked in the labor kind of realm, what was your observation about the legislative milieu?
Well, I came into the House, and I did think that the House was incredibly structured and oriented towards caucus development and caucus decision-making. And
It's very much a team sport.
very much. And so I watched and learned, and I was in the minority virtually the entire time I was. There was a couple of years where we were tied, but it was very frustrating to me to have that kind of situation. I felt really empowered when I was able to get to the Senate, and we were in a slim majority. I think we had 1 or 2 vote majority in the Senate, but we had an ability to actually get some things done, and there was an ability to also work across the aisle in the Senate, much more so than there is in the House, and I believe that still is the case today. I feel that when we do have the opportunity to work across the aisle with your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who are Republicans in my case, and get to yes with them, that the work you're doing has a much better chance of standing the test of time and not being, at some future date when you're in the minority, trampled over and repealed.
Well, since you raised that point, let me ask you about what you've observed over the years in terms of, and I realize most bills to this day pass with bipartisan support. The vast majority do. But of course, it's that 20% that really surface the partisan divide. And now, we're in a year when several key planks of the Democratic platform of the last few years are on the ballot. So what is your observation about working across the aisle, and in particular about your own party, which is very much in power,
Correct.
going it alone,
Right.
and perhaps setting up the scenario now where there's a referendum?
Well, the initiatives on the ballot were not really popular initiatives. They were bought and paid for initiatives by a very wealthy person who has a very strong ideology. So that's clear. It was not done by popular uprising. I can look at my emails.
Not
and
too many initiatives are anymore. It's
Yes,
all,
they actually are. They grow out of a discontent that you hear about, and it may not crystallize all that quickly, but you've known about it, you've heard about it, and so it's not a surprise.
But it takes deep pockets to get on the ballot these days.
It does, and it takes also, I believe, popular support, and I don't think those initiatives have that much popular support. We'll see.
We'll see. So how would you grade, though, Democrats and sort of, again, as observing change over time in terms of the ability to work across the aisle, bipartisanship versus more partisanship?
Sometimes you have to have leadership, and when it becomes one of those which side are you on questions, you have to take action. Climate change is one of those issues. You have to take action. We have no choice. We have to deal with it. And whether or not we can get our colleagues across the aisle to agree on every piece of it, perhaps not, but we have to take action, I believe. So I think those kinds of things are rare, but vitally important to take real steps forward.
I know you've said it in the past, and this is part of your book, that there's a point, compromise is good up to a point, and then at some point you put your values on the line and you may need to walk away.
You need to
or I
know
guess
what-
in other cases, if you've got the votes, you just push right on through the opposition.
Sometimes, rarely, sometimes you have to do that.
What you also, I think, advise becoming something of a subject matter expert in areas and developing some expertise, because otherwise it's sort of the smorgasbord. So healthcare, labor law, certainly were two areas of expertise
budget.
for you, and budget.
Yeah, those are the three
Kind of legs of the
trifecta
stool,
from my
yeah.
perspective. And it was determined in part because I was chair of the healthcare committee for 10 years plus, in a very exciting time for healthcare.
Which was when the Affordable Care Act was coming
Correct.
online.
Yes,
and the
yes.
state was standing up the healthcare benefit exchange so that you
Right.
could purchase health insurance on the open market.
Correct, on a competitive market. And the process of getting to where we had that piece of federal legislation passed so that states could implement them in their own way was really difficult, very tough, but very exciting, because I felt it in a way as we were working on it, and again we worked across many states with different state legislatures. I felt we were kind of creating another Medicare system, another funded by all kinds of different streams, but having an ability to change systemically how people were able to access health care.
Well, what do you remember most about that period of time in terms of it? Was it the complexity of setting up the exchange? Was it the political fight? Or did the money was coming, so what in particular about that stands
It was actually we weren't in so much trouble setting it up. We had to get the original federal legislation passed in order to do the setup. But what we had done earlier was pass little pieces of the plan into state statute. For instance, we passed the law, I sponsored it some years before the ACA, that kids could stay on their parents' health plan until they were 26 years old. And that was already in place, and we already had that kind of agreement and understanding on how to do that. Those kinds of pieces of the ACA were in place in our state. So setting up the healthcare exchange was much smoother and much more successful because of that pre-work we had done.
And I know you're very proud of that. I do want to just ask you, as healthcare chair in general, what was it like working with the various stakeholders? The public advocates, the insurance companies, the medical providers. The intensity of the lobbying around healthcare is intense.
Yes, it
Did I
is.
just use that word twice?
Absolutely, it is highly intense, and there are many different stakeholders. I will say the most active and intense stakeholders are the big pharmaceutical companies. And so since I left being chair of healthcare, I started, still on the committee as a member, I started focusing on prescription drugs, because that is one of the fastest growing costs in our medical world, is prescription drug costs. And so I focused in on that and worked directly with advocates and the pharmaceutical industries to try and rein in costs, try to get transparency for drug costs, and more information about drug costs because it's a very black hole where the dollars go and where the deals are. And we got the it was first $100 cap on insulin passed, and then we got it down to $35. And that's not only for seniors, it's for anybody on any public program. So we were taking it bite by bite in terms of that group of lobbyists, which is the biggest and most well-endowed group of lobbyists we have.
With healthcare, it seems like things move at kind of a glacial pace. We always talk about the costs. It's a very rigid system. How frustrating was it to work on healthcare policy?
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. And I think we got some big steps done. The one thing I will say, however, when the Great Recession hit and I was healthcare chair, we were tasked with cutting our budget by 1/3 in 60 days. Because of the Great Recession, as we were having collapsing banks, Washington Mutual went under, housing foreclosures were skyrocketing. It was a real catastrophe for our economy, and so sales taxes dropped precipitously. The biggest health care program the state had at the time was the Basic Health Plan. The Basic Health Plan was an entirely state program paid for by state dollars.
Predated the ACA.
Predated the Affordable Care Act, and it was a wonderful program for low-income and immigrant workers because there was no federal involvement. It could cover people who were not documented as well. As the premiums were not free, but they were reasonable, $50, $98 a month.
But when the recession hit,
We had to cut it to about 2/3, and what we did was created it as a Medicaid match program so we could pull down federal matching dollars, which means we had to kick off all of the immigrant workers because they cannot access anything with federal dollars. So they were left out in the cold. I cried myself to sleep night after night trying to get that figured out. And we did it, and I regret that we did it, but we had no choice.
paid family leave, family and medical leave is something the state was an early adopter of, and also something you worked directly on, you shepherded. Just reflect for a moment on sort of the pride of ownership of that.
I am just thrilled that we have an implemented program in our state that's really working well.
Apparently it's quite popular, too.
It's one of the most popular programs we have in the state, and for good reason. It really helps people keep their jobs, helps them take care of their family, and it gets them by. It's a safety net for people, and they are willing to pay for it through premiums that come out of their paychecks, and we were able to negotiate that on a bipartisan basis. It wasn't easy. It was a long-running issue. You know, we actually passed the original paid family and medical leave bill in 2007, but then the Great Recession hit,
so it wasn't funded.
and it got sidetracked.
Right.
We couldn't implement. So finally, we got it done.
One observation I have about you as a legislator, and maybe this has its roots in the fact you started your career as a reporter, is that your legislation often was very responsive to the moment that the state found itself in. You responded to the Me Too movement by going after non-disclosure agreements, for instance, when people separated from employment. And on the business side of things, or in the labor side of things, other bills you got through requiring businesses to provide accommodations for pregnant employees, passing the Employee Free Choice Act, which I think is your last bill that passed, to essentially say that employers cannot make their employees captive audiences of anti-union meetings or meetings about religion or any other topic. But on the labor side, and also sort of this idea of what's the issue of the moment? How are you trying to kind of marry those two things and use your legacy in labor, working in the organized labor realm to legislate on behalf of workers?
Well, you're right. I have always been oriented towards topical issues, obviously. And one of the problems is you read the newspaper and you say, I got to do something about that.
Yeah.
And I do, usually. But now I don't have to.
Right.
But anyway, so things come to your attention, and you think you can.
But that was kind of in your DNAs.
That's in my
you would
DNA.
see that and you'd say,
That's
hey,
right.
we should do something.
We can do
Yeah.
something about that. Let's do something about that. And so I was often a little bit ahead of the curve because you need to have advocates. You need to have people supporting you, and you can't just go out on your own all the time. You have to be careful about that because if you think you know best, you will soon learn you
Learn
don't.
otherwise, right?
Right.
So we've talked about sort of your healthcare legacy. What were you trying to accomplish on the worker labor side of the ledger?
Right, a little more power balance between employers and employees. Employers have so much power over their workers and their employees because, of course, they can always be terminated or they can, in other words, make your life miserable with issues.
But the other thing that's occurring to me about this is you picked these areas which are like the battle royale arenas, right?
Yes.
Healthcare and then labor versus
Right.
business. I mean, you could argue almost everything cleaves along those lines, and that you threw yourself right into that fire.
Right. I have obviously the history. I was actually my shop steward when I was a television
Yeah.
reporter, so I have the history, and it's in my DNA for that too. But you're right. I am not afraid of a fight, but I would rather come to yes. And I think the part of the labor world that I really advocate is the art of negotiation. Because if you negotiate in good faith and you are honest and forthright and knowledgeable, you can get to yes with somebody who doesn't always agree with you. It may not be 100% yes, but it might be a piecemeal yes, and it might be a I'm not as opposed as I used to be a position. But you can make progress with honest negotiations, and I think that's the genius of the legislative process.
What do you say to business leaders in this state who say Democrats have made it too expensive, too hard, too regulated to run a business or to run a profitable business or to want to run a business in this state?
We're in the top 5 in terms of rankings for business and labor in this state for the whole country. And it varies
So no
between
apologies,
2
no
and 3.
regrets about the policies that
I
Democrats
think it's a
have-
win-win. I think it's a win-win. I think when you have a well-trained, skilled, and adequate workforce, that you will have successful businesses. And we have accommodated businesses many times. As you know, the Boeing tax break, for instance. We've accommodated businesses in many different situations.
What
But
about the small business climate?
And the small businesses have their accommodation with a fairly, a B&O tax exemption up to, I believe, I could be
I
wrong
should-
because
I
it's
should-
changed
I
up
should know this
to
too, but-
about $70,000 or maybe $80,000. So,
I think the vast majority, in theory at least, are supposed
right.
to be exempt.
But let me just say this about regulations. They don't come out of thin air. Virtually every regulation on the book came from a problem that came forward and needed attention. Whether it was E. coli in hamburgers or was some other issue that came forward. And it was deemed by not the agency, but by the legislature, that regulation should be enacted or considered at least.
We could spend probably the next hour, and we don't have time to do that, going through other bills you passed in your career. Let me ask you about anything you didn't get passed that stands as a disappointment or a failure or a regret.
2 areas that I wish I could have done more and wish somebody will do more. One is the developing area of artificial intelligence. I think
That's just getting going now.
that is well underway. And it is a major issue that needs to be grappled with at the state level because I have no concept that Congress
Right.
will be able to act
And you've
on
actually
this.
been participating in
Yes.
a multi-state
Yes.
effort on this,
Absolutely.
learning about it. And
Absolutely, because fundamentally,
do you
I'm-
think Washington is moving too slowly? I know we have a task force now,
I
but
think
other
we
states
need
are
to-
regulating.
I think, well, what just happened in California with the veto of the bill that they passed on safeguards is informing. We need to take a look at that and see where we can go with that. I also think that we need to have a basic policy that you can't use other people's work without paying for it. It's called royalty, or it's called
Copyright.
copyright,
or
but you have to
intellectual
have
property.
a standard. And currently that's not clear, and we have a lot of misuse of people's works.
Is there another area besides AI?
And the other one that is frustrating is childcare. Childcare is a broken system. It needs higher level of pay for its workers, and for its system, but the parents who need it cannot afford to pay it. And they end up paying for their children for 4 or 5 years in childcare more than they would for college tuition and books and residency. So we have got to address childcare because you cannot have an adequate workforce when families are torn apart like that and are under that kind of duress.
We have less than 2 minutes left. I want to bring this back to where we began, because while you worked for much of your career on these big structural issues like healthcare, like the balance between labor and business, you also did not stop working on SeaTac issues. And it also is, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics are local.
That's right.
So let's leave on that note. What do you feel you accomplished, and what's left undone when it comes to your hometown constituents?
Well, as you know, SeaTac Airport is running out of room and time and space, and a come to reckoning will have to happen here in the next few years because something has to be done to increase capacity for aviation. We tried through a commission process and 3 years of very difficult work to come up with some alternatives, but it wasn't successful. It needs to be revisited. It needs to be looked at and developed because there are not a lot of options. We cannot all drive to Portland to get out of town, but that's what it's going to come to if we don't take this on. And in addition, we have made some progress. Finally, the Port of Seattle Commission worked with us this last year to get a program going to address some of the failed noise packages.
Oh, right.
And so that
Noise mitigation,
was an increasingly encouraging sign that they're willing to work with us.
Okay. Just briefly, what are you going to do in your post-legislative life?
I don't know.
But you're not, you said you weren't just going to sit around reading romance
I am
novels.
not actually a retiring type person.
Okay.
Right.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
On this retirement, or preferment as some people call it, and on your decades of service.
Thank you,
Thanks
Austin.
for coming in for the exit
It's
interview.
been such an honor and such a privilege to be able to do this work.
Good to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
Congratulations. And when we return, we'll talk with longtime Republican State Senator Mike Padden of Spokane Valley, who is also retiring this year. Back after this.
Watch all of TVW's award-winning shows on your time at tvw.org.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me now is State Senator Mike Padden, a Republican from Spokane Valley, who is retiring from the legislature after nearly 30 years, split between 2 different periods of service in the legislature. Welcome to the program, and congratulations on this retirement.
Well, thank you, Austin. Always good to be with you.
Let me just do a brief biographical sketch of your history in the legislature. Here is some background on Senator Padden. He was first elected to the Washington State House in 1980 and went on to serve for more than 14 years. He then left the legislature to become a Spokane County District Judge. He was elected to the State Senate in 2011, where he serves as the ranking Republican on the Law and Justice Committee. He is known as a champion of stricter drunk driving laws and a leader of anti-abortion efforts in Washington. And while he served in the majority for a time in both the House and the Senate, Padden often points to his work to craft bipartisan legislation while working with majority Democrats as a member of the minority party. And I want to start with that because that does seem like a theme. And almost, I want to try to bring 2 sort of opposing ideas together. One is I think of you as one of the more conservative members of the state Senate in this legislature. And at the same time, you do have a remarkable track record of working with the majority party and finding common ground, co-sponsoring bills and getting bills passed. How do we explain that?
Well, I think people might respect the principles that I have. And the other thing is I try to be friendly with everybody. I never want to burn any bridges. And you always can find something positive, I think, about every member. It's even more true in the Senate than it was in the House, since we only have 49 senators and 98 members of the House. So I think that's it. But you're right. The Conservative Political Action Committee right now gives me a 92% rating lifetime. I have had some sessions where other members have been a higher rating. But not that that's the be-all and end-all. But yeah, generally I am fairly conservative. But there's a lot of opportunities, and for whatever reason, people have come to me with bills that weren't my ideas, but I thought they were good ideas, and they turned out to be popular. And some had support that I never thought they would, such as the employee ownership bill, which passed unanimously, Senate Bill 5096 last session.
Since you raised that, let's explain what this is. And I have to say, when I was looking at this, I thought, this sounds like it could be an idea that Democrats would be more interested in than Republicans. But and you can, fill in the blanks here. But my understanding is it's essentially creating an avenue for a business to become employee-owned, especially if the owner is preparing to retire, doesn't have somebody to sell to, and wants to keep the business going. But what got you interested in this particular idea of an employee stock ownership plan and taking control of a company?
Yeah, actually a constituent who had taken a mortgage company from a sole proprietorship to an employee-owned business and talked about all the benefits. Some of the Democrats like the benefits because it's great for the workers. I also like what's good for the workers, and I see some real positive benefits to society in that the money stays local. A lot of these folks end up retiring very, very wealthy, such as some of the people at Schweitzer Engineering, which is the largest employee-owned business in our state of about 6,000 employees. So they've had over 100 millionaires that were just working there that have retired. So it gives people an opportunity if they want, if one spouse wants to stay home and raise the children and there's enough money coming in that they can support the family. I just think there's a lot of benefits that way, and what is good for the worker, I think, is good for our whole society.
So why is it so often that, from a partisan standpoint, we see issues break down along business and labor fault lines?
Yeah, there's some issues like that are going to happen. Prevailing wage is kind of one of the cardinal areas for the Democrats, where the Republicans see that as, an additional cost that goes beyond what the market would allow for a fair price, and just adds more cost to the taxpayer who's ever paying the prevailing wage.
But there's issues like that. There's workers' comp. We see all sorts
Right.
of tax and wage and benefit issues that do break down along partisan lines. But your point is that there are issues that can transcend those typical
Right, and
disagreements.
I'm not on that committee, but Senator King has worked with Senator Keiser on a number of bills that they got labor and business to agree on.
Something else that you are, and I pointed this out in the introduction, known for in this legislature is campaigning for stricter DUI laws. And so I want to start with, where does that passion and commitment come from?
I think it came from the time I was a district court judge, and we were able to start a DUI therapeutic court, which worked very well. But also having to sentence people and seeing it as such a preventable crime that really harms our society. And we're in a crisis situation in our state. We had over 810 fatalities in 2023. Over half of those were due to impaired driving. And we know that the combination of drugs and alcohol is what's on the ascendancy. Alcohol-only impaired driving has been going down or staying level. So we spent a lot of money as a state trying to get a marijuana breathalyzer. WSU did research for a number of years. They were never able to come up with anything. So that's why I introduced last session Senate Bill 5791 on roadside oral swabs, which are very, very similar to the portable breathalyzer test that's been around for a long time. It's a device that law enforcement would have, a portable device. It's a voluntary test. Nobody's forced to take it.
Which the breathalyzer is as well.
Right. And it's not admissible in court in and of itself. but it could be probable cause to get a warrant. And so that's the idea. Senator Leas is a big sponsor. We made great progress on it, and hopefully there'll be some other people to carry that torch next year.
You didn't get that bill this year, but you did get a bill passed and signed this year to extend the look-back period for prior DUI convictions from 10 years to 15 years. What's the significance there?
Well,
This is for repeat offenders, right?
Right. These are people in our state to have a felony DUI takes the fourth offense. Oregon and Idaho are three. Most states are three or less. And then a lot of states have no time limit on it at all. It's during your lifetime. But we had a 10-year time limit, and we were able to.
So 4 within 10 years.
Yeah, now it's 4 within 15 years as a result of the bill being signed. The bills on DUIs almost always had support of the Attorney General, of the Governor, the City of Seattle. I mean, definitely very bipartisan. Of course, law enforcement very strongly behind it, and the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So we need to do more in that area when other states are having more success, and that's these oral swabs. In Indiana, once everybody was trained, the number of fatalities from impaired driving went down 10%.
The felony DUI, you ran bills year after year, and one of the arguments against was cost, I believe. Remind us of what happened, though. Did you ever get a felony DUI bill through?
I got it from 5 to 4.
5 to 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was after several years of trying.
Right. And the same thing on the look back. That took 3 or 4 years. So there is a resistance. I think the hospitality industry, I'm not sure they have a correct view on this sort of legislation, but they have been concerned about it in the past.
One more question on this topic, which is there's growing talk about lowering the BAC limit from 0.08 to 0.05. Utah has done this. The bill's been introduced here. Hawaii has considered this. I imagine you would support that, but what?
Well, I voted for it. I would actually prefer 0.06 to go down from 0.08.
How come?
Previous was 0.10 that went to 0.08.
Yeah.
So I think from 0.08 to 0.05 is a little too much, but I did, given our crisis situation, support it. But it deals only with the alcohol impaired driving and doesn't really deal with the drug and alcohol, which, like I indicated, is a more pressing problem.
Growing issue, yeah. Okay, I want to step back and sort of go back to this theme that I sort of established at the beginning, which is you are one of the more conservative members of the legislature. At the same time, you're working across the aisle, and I've often wondered if you're from Spokane Valley. I think you've said yourself that your politics and views match well with your district, but they are not aligned with much of Washington. And so I'm really interested about your observations and experience in the legislature, for instance, on issues like abortion, where you have been a leader in efforts, for the most part unsuccessful because you haven't been in the party of power, to restrict or limit access to abortion. And at the same time, this is a state that is very much in favor of and supporting abortion rights. How have you reconciled kind of your personal beliefs around that issue, your activism on that issue, with the reality on the ground?
Well, when I first ran in 1980, I had come from the pro-life movement. That was what really motivated me to run. I ran initially against a Democrat who had voted for state funding of abortions and was the only one in Spokane County that had that. He later decided not to run, but that was the motivation. People asked me to run for the Senate my first time out, and I didn't want to because the senator was William Day, a Democrat, but he was pro-life. So that was a motivating factor. And, you know, we've come so far, Austin, to show and prove the humanity of the unborn child. We're doing these marvelous operations in utero at 2 months or even sooner, and the unborn child has to receive anesthesia because it's painful for the operation. So, I mean, to me, the humanity of the unborn child has become more and more evidenced by science. And unfortunately, I don't think people hear the pro-life side very much in our state. So whatever I can do to promote that, I want to. I did get a bill through in 1981 that said a baby born alive during abortion should have the same treatment as a premature baby of the same age. So that actually passed and was signed by Governor Spellman.
What is your then observations or thoughts about this issue in the current context of Roe v. Wade having been overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court? A number of very restrictive abortion laws have gone into effect in Republican-led states. So we've seen sort of the pendulum swing in many places, while here in Washington, Democrats have essentially doubled down to ensure protection of and access to abortion services.
Yeah, I think it's really a political move on behalf of the Democrats. I think it's extremely unlikely today that any pro-life legislation could get through. Perhaps in the future, but I mean, right now, the prospects for the Republicans to get control of both the House and Senate and the governorship with people that would support pro-life is gone. And there used to be a few pro-life Democrats, but they're pretty gone. Senator Jim Hargrove, Senator Mark Malosha, who later switched parties, and there were a few others. When I was in the House, there were a lot of old-time Democrats like John L. O'Brien and P.J. Gallagher and others that were pro-life. So a lot of that has changed.
Is there any part of you that feels like you were, serving in the wrong state given your political ideology and core beliefs?
Well, I mean, you could look at my neighboring state, Idaho, which the pro-life legislation can pass very easily. I would have preferred to be in a state that had more pro-life legislators, but I still felt, and my district knew my position, is known it all along, and generally, I would say is pro-life.
Another issue where you were at odds with the majority and at odds with the majority of voters, I believe, I mean, certainly, would be on same-sex marriage. You voted against it in 2012. You said to change, this is quoting you, to change such a fundamental pillar of our society is not only foolish, but dangerous. First off, have your views on that changed in the ensuing decade plus?
Well, they're still there. I haven't been quite as outspoken as I was then, but I did say I was concerned about religious liberty and the conflict between the gay rights movement and religious liberty at the time. I remember on the floor, Senator Lewis and Senator Peterson spoke when the decision came out, and I spoke briefly on the other side just to point that out. And that's proven true. There have been these conflicts. It's still a major conflict within the federal judiciary and other bills that are coming up. And we've had the Arlene Flowers case in our state.
Sure.
So it's still there. I still have the same beliefs, but I would acknowledge that society is gone somewhat in a different direction on that.
You served on the Law and Justice Committee as the ranking Republican with Jamie Peterson, who you just mentioned. And I can't remember, were you also the chair when he was your ranking?
Yes,
Yeah.
I was, yeah.
So he is openly gay. He is was one of the lawyers involved in that case and upholding this, and is married. And so I'm also curious about that relationship and how you navigated, the two of you navigated that, given how diametrically opposed you were in terms of your life experience and your beliefs, and yet you seem to have a working relationship.
Well, Senator Peterson always was honest and direct with me. I never felt he was going to play any games when he was the ranking member. So I felt I treated him very fairly, and he certainly treated me very fairly. And then there's other bills that we have where we did have agreement. A lot of his bills that he works with the Uniform Law Commission were somewhat technical and, as he says, boring. I would sometimes co-sponsor those. A lot of the bills from the business law section of the Washington State Bar Association. And then he was very supportive of legislation I had to make it easier to purchase condominiums for people, reduce the price, get rid of some of the regulations, and a number of other bills. In fact, he and then Representative Drew Hansen came to me on the body camera bill years ago and asked if I would sponsor it, which I did, and they were co-sponsors. So we have been able to work together.
Did the two of you ever address head-on this issue of being so diametrically opposed on same-sex marriage?
Well, we had a number of hearings on very controversial
Bill.
matters that I chaired, and he would say, well, I know you're going to give each side equal time, and here's on our side who you should check with. And he did the same thing with me. So, and I would say I think those hearings were always run very fairly. I think part of that was my background as a judge. His is a very competent attorney, so he's a bright person. We do have fundamental disagreements on philosophical matters, but there's a lot of bills where we could work together. And like I say, his word was good. He was the majority leader. If you noticed, the Senate got its work done on time. We didn't work weekends and everything, and the House was going the other way. Now, there's different factors in each chamber, but he does a good job doing the process stuff.
Is there a lesson to be gleaned from that, though, in these polarized times we're in, when we see such polarization and examples of people sort of highlighting their differences and leaning into that rather than saying, we're never going to align on some of these deeply personal issues, but we can still work together? I mean, that does seem like not the norm these days.
Well, I would say it's not the norm, certainly on the federal level in the U.S. Congress and the Senate, but in our state, especially in the Senate, I think there still is a lot of civility. Our lieutenant governor has made a special effort on that, and I think generally the senators agree with that and work together relatively well. We do have our issues, and sometimes they flare up, but it's amazing how often we do agree.
I had forgotten that kind of in the midst of the COVID crisis, you were one of the founding members of a new Freedom Caucus in the state Senate, which was sort of the most conservative members of the Senate.
Yeah, our real founder was the late Senator Doug Erickson, and a very bright guy, Ivy League educated, and he got us going. But we felt it was necessary to speak and point out some issues. If we see something that we thought was way out of whack, we might be able to point it out better than our Senate Republican leadership could. The leadership was fine with us having the Freedom Caucus, and it worked pretty well. I think we lost a little bit of our spark when Senator Erickson died, but we're still going, and hopefully it'll continue.
Well, let me ask you about just what this says about your relationship with your own party and your own caucus, and the extent to which you perhaps were more conservative than leadership, at least, if not the majority of your caucus. What was that dynamic like?
Well, sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't quite so good. I mean, we'd have differences, obviously, in elections. And I mean, recently I supported Senator Jim McCune, who's been a member of the Freedom Caucus, had not involved in any scandal or anything, and yet our leadership tried to defeat him in the primary. They were not successful, and to me that was a waste of money. It could have been going to try to protect other Republicans that are under attack, such as Senator Curtis King or others or Senator Musal. So I thought that money was wasted, and I did let some people know. But it's a free world out there, and people can do things, and we'll see what happens.
You were much more of the mold of a traditional social conservative. What is your observation about the direction the Republican Party has gone in this country, and the rise of Trump and the atmosphere that
Yeah.
we're in right now?
Well, I mean, it's a mixed bag, but Trump's election in 2016, he did have strong support from social conservatives, a lot of whom have strong religious beliefs, not necessarily one denomination, but whether the evangelicals or Catholics, traditional Catholics, or LDS folks, or Orthodox Jews, or even Orthodox Muslims that may have agreement on social issues. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's still a chance for a comeback on some of these issues. As you know, Austin, there's a tremendous blowback on transgender people competing in women's sports and winning things. And I think that is an issue that the majority of the country is on our side on.
Are you supporting him this time around?
Am I supporting?
Donald Trump. for
Oh,
president.
yes. Yeah, I definitely support him. I mean, I think the alternative is very scary. I mean, Harris had a record really to the left of Bernie Sanders, and of course she's flip-flopped on a number of things. And so I mean, nobody's perfect, and he certainly has some of his faults, but the policies, I mean, at the time he was president, we were economically very sound. We were energy independent. A lot of Middle East states were recognizing Israel. I mean, we were in much better shape when he was president than we are now as a country, in my view.
Okay, I'm really going to change gears, and I'm going to ask you, because time is short, about your crusade to get us on year-round Pacific Standard Time. Not Daylight Savings Time, which requires Congress to approve, but Pacific Standard Time, which we could do it by ourselves or with a couple other states. Didn't get that one through yet either, completely.
No, we didn't get it through. We got a lot of publicity on it, and it was a bipartisan, 13 senators, and Moncadingra was the number 2 sponsor. We were, I think, here together with you
Democrat,
speaking
yep.
about it, and there were similar efforts in California and Oregon and Idaho. So I think it will eventually happen. People eventually are going to get tired of switching back and forth. And while our state would prefer, I think, year-round daylight time, I think they will prefer year-round standard time over switching back and forth all the time. There's a lot of health reasons and other things that make it attractive. And it's worked in Arizona and it's worked in Hawaii. So, I mean, eventually there's going to be a breakthrough, I hope.
In the minute or so we have left, I want you to be able to reflect on your career, again, spanning almost 30 years over 2 different periods of service in this legislature in this state.
Well, I feel very blessed that I ended up running in the 4th Legislative District, and that my views and the views of my constituents melded together, and they reelected me so many times, and that I've been able to have an impact, make a difference in a number of areas. I'm going to miss it, and I'm trying to hand off a number of issues to different folks. But no, it was definitely an honor, and I'm just very fortunate to have been able to be in the legislature.
Any advice for your successor or for lawmakers coming up behind you?
Well, I just think you don't ever want to burn any bridges. You want to work with people. Your words got to be good, and you know, I think that goes a long ways, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's something that can be a big benefit not only to you but to your district and the views that you have.
Any great disappointment, just briefly?
Oh, you know, I mean, some of the bills that didn't pass. I still, on the DUI stuff, I would go way farther than we have. I think we should be down to maybe the 3rd being
The felony.
a felony. You know, a number of things like that.
Last question, what will you be doing on that first day of the legislative session when you don't have to drive across the state and be here?
No, well, I'm going to be having lunch with Cinder Billig, and we're going to discuss things.
An outgoing Democrat, former Senate Majority
Democrat, and
Leader.
we
So
work-
you're going to have a bipartisan lunch
Right,
to toast your
at-
joint retirement.
Right at Phelps Field, which is right in between our districts, kind of. It's in the 3rd, but just barely. And I've been very involved in former Senator Bumgarner's congressional race, so I may end up doing some things for him, assuming the election goes well for him in November.
Okay. Senator Mike Padden, thank you for the exit interview. Congratulations on this retirement and your years of service.
Well, thank you, Austin.
Good to talk to you.
Good talking to you.
And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.